Blood soaked through her torn dress like desert rain through cracked earth. The Apache warrior's shadow fell across her broken body, but when she spoke those words, begging for quick death, something shifted in the dust between them. He had expected screams, prayers, bargaining. Instead, she offered him her throat with the dignity of a dying eagle. The dirt beneath her held secrets darker than her wounds, and in her eyes he saw not the fear of a settler woman, but the hollow stare of someone already dead inside. Her whispered plea cut deeper than any blade he'd ever carried. The sun hung like a copper coin against the endless sky when Maria Delacroix felt the first arrow pierce her shoulder. She had been hanging laundry behind the cabin, white sheets dancing in the desert wind like ghosts of better days, when the attack came swift and silent as a hawk's descent. The clothesline snapped, sending her husband's shirts tumbling into the dust, and she knew with terrible certainty that Thomas would never wear them again. The Apache warrior emerged from behind the water barrel, his face painted with ochre and ash, his eyes holding the cold fire of justified vengeance. She pressed her back against the cabin wall, feeling the rough wood catch at her torn sleeve, and tasted copper in her mouth. The warrior moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step deliberate and measured, his moccasins silent against the hard-packed earth. Maria's breath came in shallow gasps, her hand instinctively moving to the wound in her shoulder where warm blood seeped between her fingers like spilled wine. She had heard the stories whispered in town, tales of Apache raids that left nothing but ashes and screams, but she had never imagined the strange intimacy of facing death alone in her own backyard. The sheets continued their ghostly dance around them, creating a macabre theater where hunter and hunted performed their ancient ritual. Her legs trembled beneath her calico dress, and she wondered if Thomas had died quickly or if he too had felt this terrible weight of approaching darkness. The warrior's gaze swept over her with the calculating precision of a man who had killed before, his fingers wrapped around the handle of a knife that caught the afternoon light like a fragment of fallen star. Maria found herself studying his face, searching for some trace of mercy in the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the hard line of his mouth. His hair fell in black waves past his shoulders, adorned with feathers that spoke of victories she didn't want to imagine, and his chest bore scars that told stories of survival in a land that showed no quarter to the weak. She pressed harder against the cabin wall, feeling splinters bite into her palm, and realized that her death would be just another story carved into this unforgiving landscape. The wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something that smelled like the end of everything she had ever known. Time seemed to stretch like heated metal as they regarded each other across the small space that separated life from death. Maria's mind raced through fragments of memory. Her wedding day in St. Louis, the journey west in a covered wagon, Thomas's promises of a new life under endless skies. The irony wasn't lost on her that she would die surrounded by the very freedom they had sought, her blood watering the same soil that had promised them prosperity. The warrior took another step closer, and she could see the war paint more clearly now, intricate patterns that transformed his face into something both terrible and beautiful. Her shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, sending waves of fire down her arm, but the physical pain seemed distant compared to the crushing weight of her circumstances. The silence between them grew heavy with unspoken words and the weight of cultural chasms that no bridge could span. Maria thought of her sister back in Missouri, probably sitting in a parlor at this very moment, worried about nothing more pressing than which dress to wear to Sunday service. The contrast struck her like a physical blow, the civilized world continuing its gentle rhythms, while she faced her final moments in this harsh theater of survival. The warrior's eyes never left her face, and she wondered what he saw there, what judgment he was forming about her worthiness to live or die. Her free hand clutched at the fabric of her dress, a gesture both protective and futile, while the desert wind continued its relentless song through the scattered laundry. As the warrior raised his knife, the blade catching fire in the dying light, Maria felt something break inside her chest. Not her ribs or her heart, but something deeper, some last thread of hope that had kept her tethered to the belief that mercy might exist even in this godless place. The words that came from her lips surprised them both with their quiet dignity, cutting through the desert air like a prayer offered to an indifferent sky. "If you must kill me, do it quickly." The Apache warrior's hand froze mid-motion, the knife suspended between intention and action, like a bird caught in an invisible web. He had expected the usual litany of settler responses: screaming, begging, promises of gold or land or anything that might purchase another breath of life. Instead, this woman with blood darkening her dress had spoken with the calm acceptance of a warrior facing an honorable death, and something in her tone made him pause to truly see her for the first time. Her face, pale beneath the desert sun, held no trace of the arrogance he had come to associate with her people, no assumption that her white skin granted her special dispensation from the harsh justice of the frontier. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of her blood and something else, fear, yes, but also a strange kind of peace that he recognized from his own people's death songs. Maria watched the warrior's expression change, subtle as the shift of shadows at twilight, and realized that her words had somehow altered the trajectory of this moment. She had spoken from a place beyond hope or strategy, from the deep well of exhaustion that comes when fighting becomes more painful than surrender. Her shoulder continued to bleed, each drop falling to the dust like a countdown to whatever came next. But she found herself oddly calm in the face of his hesitation. The sheets around them had finally settled, hanging limp and stained in the still air, creating an intimate arena where two people from different worlds struggled to understand the language of dignity. She could see something working behind his dark eyes, some internal calculation that went beyond the simple arithmetic of revenge. The warrior lowered his knife slowly, his gaze never leaving her face, and Maria felt a flutter of something that might have been hope if she had dared to name it. He spoke then, his English rough but clear words that seemed to cost him something in the speaking. "You do not beg." It wasn't a question, but an observation, delivered with the weight of someone who had heard too many desperate pleas echo across too many killing grounds. Maria nodded once, a small movement that sent fresh fire through her wounded shoulder, and replied with quiet honesty, "Begging won't change what you've decided." The simplicity of her response seemed to strike him like a physical blow, and she watched as he took an involuntary step backward, his warrior's composure cracking just enough to reveal the man beneath the war paint. The silence that followed felt different from the tense quiet that had preceded it, less like the calm before execution, and more like the pause between movements in some complex dance neither of them fully understood. Maria found herself studying the warrior's face with the strange clarity that comes in moments of extreme crisis, noting the way his jaw tightened as he wrestled with thoughts she couldn't fathom. His free hand moved to touch something at his throat, a small pouch or amulet hidden beneath his shirt, and she realized that he, too, carried burdens that went beyond the immediate violence of their encounter. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which way the scales of fate would tip, while the sun continued its relentless journey toward the horizon. Something shifted in the warrior's stance, a subtle relaxation that spoke of a decision made, though Maria couldn't yet read the nature of that choice in his guarded expression. He sheathed his knife with deliberate slowness, the gesture somehow more ominous than reassuring, and she wondered if he had simply chosen a different method for her death. But when he spoke again, his words carried a weight that suggested something far more complex than simple mercy. "You are not what I expected to find here." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her, and Maria felt the ground beneath her feet shift in ways that had nothing to do with her physical wounds. She pressed her back more firmly against the cabin wall, using its solid presence to anchor herself, as the world around her took on the surreal quality of a fever dream. The warrior's gaze moved past her to the cabin itself, taking in details she hadn't considered. The careful construction, the small garden plot where she had tried to coax vegetables from the stubborn soil, the wind chimes Thomas had made from bits of metal that now sang a mournful song in the desert breeze. When his eyes returned to her face, they held a different quality, as if he were seeing not just another settler to be eliminated, but a person whose life had weight and meaning, beyond the simple fact of her presence on disputed land. Maria felt tears threaten for the first time since the attack began, not from fear, but from the unexpected recognition she saw reflected in his dark gaze, the acknowledgement that she was more than just an obstacle to be removed from his path. The moment stretched between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably real, while the desert wind continued its ancient song and the shadows grew longer around their unlikely encounter. The Apache warrior's hand remained frozen above his knife, caught between the momentum of violence and something unnamed that had taken root in his chest. Sarah's breathing came in shallow gasps, each one a small rebellion against the pain that coursed through her like liquid fire. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the very earth understood that something profound was shifting in this moment between strangers. Her green eyes, though clouded with pain, held a clarity that unsettled him, not the wild fear he expected, but a strange acceptance that made his warrior's heart stumble. The blood from her wound had begun to darken against the pale fabric of her dress, creating patterns that reminded him of the war paint his grandfather once wore. He found himself studying the curve of her face, the way her auburn hair caught the dying light, and wondered when he had stopped seeing her as prey and begun seeing her as something else entirely. The silence between them stretched like a taut bowstring, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of choices that could not be undone. Sarah watched his face, searching for some sign of what would come next, her fingers still pressed against the wound that throbbed with each heartbeat. She had heard stories of Apache warriors, tales whispered in frightened voices around campfires and in the safety of parlors, but none of those stories had prepared her for the complexity she saw in his dark eyes. There was violence there, yes, but also something deeper, a pain that seemed to mirror her own, though born of different sorrows. The desert wind picked up again, stirring the dust around them and carrying with it the scent of sage and something wilder, something that spoke of freedom and loss in equal measure. She realized that her fear had transformed into something else, a strange curiosity about this man who held her life in his hands like a bird that might either be released or crushed. The warrior's gaze moved from her face to the horizon, where the sun continued its relentless descent toward the mountains. Time was slipping away like sand through his fingers, and with it, the certainty he had carried into this encounter. His people would expect him to return with proof of his victory, with the scalp that would mark him as a true defender of their sacred lands. But something in this woman's eyes had awakened a memory he thought he had buried, the face of his sister, taken by soldiers 3 winters ago, her own green eyes wide with the same desperate dignity he saw now. The parallel struck him like a physical blow, and he found his hand trembling as he struggled with the weight of recognition. Sarah represented everything his people had been taught to hate, yet in this moment she seemed to embody something else entirely, a shared humanity that transcended the boundaries of race and revenge. The desert around them began to take on the golden hue of approaching evening, painting their unlikely tableau in shades of amber and shadow. Sarah felt the strength slowly ebbing from her body, each breath requiring more effort than the last, but her spirit remained unbroken. She thought of her husband, dead now these 3 days, and wondered if this was how their story was meant to end. Not in the comfort of their small ranch house, but here in the vastness of a land that cared nothing for human dreams or sorrows. The Apache warrior seemed to sense her weakening, his eyes returning to her face with something that might have been concern. She wanted to speak, to bridge the chasm between them with words, but found that language seemed inadequate for what was passing between them in this sacred moment of suspended time. The warrior's internal struggle played out across his features like clouds moving across the face of the moon. He had been raised to see the white settlers as destroyers, as thieves who took without asking and killed without mercy. Yet this woman challenged everything he had been taught to believe. Her courage in the face of death reminded him of his own people's warriors, the way they faced their final moments with dignity intact. The knife in his hand felt heavier now, weighted with the gravity of choice and the knowledge that whatever he decided in the next few moments would echo through the rest of his days. He could hear the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, its cry seeming to ask the same question that burned in his heart. What did honor truly demand when mercy and justice seemed to pull in opposite directions? As the shadows lengthened and the desert began its transformation from day to night, both the warrior and the wounded woman found themselves suspended in a moment that would define not just their fates, but their very understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that seemed determined to strip away such recognition at every turn. The Apache warrior slowly lowered his knife, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight like a prayer made manifest. Sarah watched this gesture with eyes that had grown heavy with pain and something that might have been hope, though she dared not name it for fear it would vanish like a mirage. The desert around them seemed to exhale, releasing the tension that had held the very air captive. And in that release, something new was born, not trust perhaps, but the possibility of it. The warrior's face remained impassive, but Sarah caught the subtle shift in his posture, the way his shoulders seemed to carry less weight than they had moments before. She understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes to those who stand at the threshold between life and death, that he was fighting a battle as fierce as any she had ever witnessed, though it raged entirely within the confines of his own heart. The warrior knelt beside her, his movements careful and deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, not from fear now, but from the unexpected gentleness in his approach. His hands, which she had imagined would bring only death, moved with surprising tenderness as he examined her wound. The irony was not lost on her, that the same hands that had been prepared to end her life might now be the ones to preserve it. She felt the warmth of his touch through the torn fabric of her dress and realized that this was the first human contact she had experienced since her husband's death 3 days ago. The loneliness that had been her constant companion suddenly seemed less absolute, softened by this unexpected connection with someone who should have been her enemy. The desert wind carried with it the scent of approaching night, that particular mixture of cooling earth and distant rain that spoke of the eternal cycle of death and renewal. The warrior's fingers worked with practiced skill, tearing strips from his own clothing to fashion a crude but effective bandage. Sarah watched his face as he worked, noting the concentration there, the way his brow furrowed with an intensity that suggested this act of mercy was costing him something precious. She wanted to speak, to thank him or ask his name, but the words seemed to lodge in her throat like stones. Instead, she found herself studying the intricate patterns of the tattoos that decorated his arms, wondering what stories they told, what victories and losses they commemorated. Each mark seemed to speak of a life lived fully, of choices made and consequences accepted, and she felt a strange kinship with this man whose world was so different from her own. As the warrior worked to stem the flow of her blood, Sarah found her mind drifting to the events that had brought her to this moment. The attack on their ranch had come without warning, swift and brutal as a summer storm. She had watched her husband fall, had seen the light fade from his eyes, and had known with terrible certainty that her own death would follow. Yet here she was, alive against all expectation, tended by the very hands that should have delivered her final blow. The paradox of it made her head spin, or perhaps that was simply the loss of blood. She felt herself growing lighter, as if the earth's hold on her was loosening, but the warrior's presence anchored her to the world of the living. His touch was real, solid, undeniable, a lifeline thrown across the chasm that separated her from the darkness that beckoned. The warrior finished his work and sat back on his heels, his dark eyes meeting hers with an expression she could not read. In the growing twilight, his face seemed carved from the same stone as the mountains that surrounded them, eternal and unchanging, yet she sensed the turmoil that raged beneath that impassive surface. He had crossed a line by helping her, had violated some code that governed his actions, and they both knew it. The weight of that transgression hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, visible and inescapable. Sarah tried to speak, to offer some word of gratitude or understanding, but found that her voice had abandoned her. Instead, she reached out with a trembling hand and touched his arm, a gesture so simple yet so profound that it seemed to bridge not just the space between them, but the vast cultural divide that should have made such contact impossible. The touch lingered for only a moment, but in that brief connection, both the warrior and the wounded woman felt something shift in the fundamental order of their world. A recognition that the lines between enemy and friend, between savage and civilized, between us and them, were perhaps not as clear as they had been taught to believe. The Apache warrior pulled his hand away from Sarah's touch, as if her fingers had burned him, but the sensation lingered on his skin like the memory of lightning. In the gathering darkness, her pale face seemed to glow with an inner light that reminded him of the moon his grandmother had taught him to revere, distant and beautiful, and somehow sacred. The bandage he had fashioned was already showing spots of red, testament to the severity of her wound. Yet she remained conscious, her green eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if she could see straight through to his soul. The desert around them had begun its nightly transformation, the harsh edges of day softening into the mysterious shadows of evening, and with that change came a shift in the very air between them. He found himself caught between two worlds, the one that had shaped him into a warrior, and this new one that seemed to be born from the simple act of choosing mercy over vengeance. Sarah felt the warrior's withdrawal like a physical loss, the absence of his touch, leaving her feeling more alone than she had since her husband's death. Yet she understood the conflict that drove him away, could see it written in the tension of his shoulders and the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. She had lived on the frontier long enough to know the stories that shaped both their peoples, the cycle of violence and retribution that had turned neighbors into enemies and transformed the vast beauty of this land into a battlefield. But here, in this moment suspended between day and night, between life and death, those stories seemed to lose their power. What mattered now was not the color of their skin or the languages they spoke, but the simple fact that they were two human beings sharing the same small patch of earth under the same infinite sky. The realization filled her with a strange peace, even as her body grew weaker and the darkness at the edges of her vision began to creep inward. The warrior rose to his feet and walked a few paces away, his silhouette stark against the deepening purple of the sky. Sarah watched him go, understanding that he needed distance to wrestle with the demons that her presence had awakened. She could hear him breathing, deep and measured, as if he were trying to center himself for some great trial. The desert wind picked up again, carrying with it the distant howl of a coyote, that lonely sound that spoke of survival and adaptation in a harsh and unforgiving world. She thought of her own journey to this place, the dreams that had brought her and her husband west, the hope for a new life that had ended so brutally just days ago. Yet even in the face of that loss, she found she could not summon hatred for this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. Perhaps it was the proximity of death that had stripped away her capacity for anger, or perhaps it was simply the recognition of a kindred spirit in the most unlikely of circumstances. When the warrior finally turned back to her, Sarah saw that something fundamental had changed in his expression. The internal battle seemed to have reached some resolution, though whether in favor of mercy or duty, she could not tell. He approached her again, moving with the fluid grace of a predator, yet there was no menace in his approach now, only a kind of resigned determination. He knelt beside her once more, and this time when he spoke, his voice was soft, barely audible above the whisper of the wind. The words were in his own language, incomprehensible to her ears, but somehow familiar to her heart, as if the emotion behind them transcended the barriers of speech. She found herself responding not to the meaning of his words, but to their tone, which carried within it the weight of sorrow and something that might have been an apology. The sound of his voice, rough with emotion, seemed to wrap around her like a blanket, offering comfort in a way she had not expected. The warrior's hand moved to the knife at his belt, and for a moment Sarah's heart stuttered with fear, wondering if his moment of mercy had passed and the inevitable was finally at hand. But instead of drawing the blade, he removed the entire sheath and set it aside, placing it beyond easy reach as if to remove temptation from his path. The gesture was small but profound, a symbolic laying down of arms that spoke louder than any words could have. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, not from pain now, but from the overwhelming recognition of what this act meant. He was choosing to see her not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a fellow human being deserving of compassion. In a world that seemed determined to divide them, he was choosing connection over conflict, understanding over hatred. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above them, the Apache warrior and the wounded woman found themselves bound together by something stronger than the forces that should have kept them apart. The simple, revolutionary act of recognizing their shared humanity in the face of a world that insisted they were enemies.